Lebanon, the mountainous pearl of the Middle East, is drowning. It drowns over land, over labor, and over liberties. Its government, which is of course rife with corruption, is trying to stay afloat in a sea of garbage by becoming even more corrupt and by brutalizing protesters, and unsurprisingly, it's still sinking. Here, we'll be analyzing a piece of very recent news dated to November 17th, 2021, State of Decay, How Rubbish Became Lebanon's Latest Dumpster Fire, by Kareem Shahayeb. This article introduces the reader to the surface of a terrible iceberg. Lebanon's cash-strapped government is short on funds to pay the waste management company contracted to collect half of the country's rubbish, going on to imply that scavengers sweep the streets searching this rubbish for anything valuable, like characters from a post-apocalyptic story tale. This article then blames this situation on the corruption and vague ineptitude of the Lebanese government, citing self-interest and an inability to protect itself from other equally self-interested entities. But that then begs the question that this article doesn't really answer. Why? The Lebanese economic crisis is the result of decades of historical context, as well as a long line of misfortunes that came with its circumstances. To begin, it would help to have a general understanding of Lebanon's history, from its inception as a mandated state ripped from the corpse of the Ottoman Empire to its incredibly destructive civil war in the 90s. To simplify things, let's start where most things start: the British, the French, and their colonies. After promising overlapping slices of the Middle East during World War I, the British and French had to make the difficult decision to just take everything almost for themselves. They established local governments which were designed to maintain their colonial interests and deliberately sectarianized regions of the Middle East that had previously held at least some shared level of identity, reference to the Ottoman League. One such example was the mandated split in northern French Levant between Lebanon and Syria. France proclaimed that it was the protector of the minority Maronite Christians in the region and that it had a right to the silk and railroads it had invested there, and sought to use that to deny its Syrian colony too much access to the Mediterranean in order to keep it from becoming powerful enough to threaten French control. In essence, the idea of the Lebanese nation did not exist until French and British diplomats invented them, according to James Gelvin. The French then carefully took advantage of the Christian minority and perfectly divided up the territory to make it just strategically useful enough without undermining Christian, and by extent their own, rule. Tensions created by this system, combined with the socioeconomic circumstances of the time, would eventually culminate in a 15-year-long civil war in Lebanon from 1974 to 1989, which was further intensified by neighboring oil states who used their riches to punch above their diplomatic weight and sow even more sectarianism into Lebanese society. The result of this humanitarian disaster was the emergence of the previously mentioned Iranian-backed Hezbollah, which quickly used its newfound power to install a corrupt and inept government that completely failed to provide many of its people with even basic needs, while its oligarchy enjoyed the luxuries of an elite, unimpeachable class of former warlords. Whatever resources they had, they wasted, and they did not have many resources to begin with. Lebanon is a small country, about 4,000 square miles, with limited access to strategic resources. Its largest exports are precious metals, jewelry, and firearms, and although its economy doesn't solely rely on any one specific thing, this is largely because Lebanon doesn't have any one specific market that it can claim. Its favorable position as a trading partner in the Mediterranean is vastly outshadowed by its economic woes and fundamental problems. Internally, the government functions like a negligent businessman. Private interests frequently take advantage of turmoil, and countless resources are wasted in order to satiate the greed of special interests, and the incompetence that comes with this lack of properly set priorities has tragic consequences. Ammonium nitrate is a potentially volatile powder given the right conditions, but it can also be used as a fertilizer. For such purposes, almost 3,000 tons of it was stored, with little regard for the fireworks stored beside it, in a Beirut port for 6 years, which according to the New York Times was within walking distance of residential neighborhoods. On August 24th, 2020, the easily preventable disaster was done waiting to happen, and a massive explosion rang throughout the capital, killing over 200 people, injuring almost 7,000 and damaging almost 100,000 properties. Dock workers had allegedly warned of this risk multiple times, only for the threat to be swept under the rug. Despite the attempts of the appointed judges, all investigations into those responsible for the negligence were stopped dead in their tracks, as politicians refused to show up for trial, or as they denounced judges for a supposed lack of impartiality, not to mention how the coinciding coronavirus pandemic dealt even further blows to the economy. As the New York Times puts it, more than 70% of the population of a once middle-income country now lives in poverty. The local currency has lost more than 90% of its value, and in 2019, the Lebanese woke up one day to learn that the banks had locked them out of their accounts, leaving depositors unable to retrieve their rapidly depreciating funds. Triple-digit hyperinflation has taken hold. Food prices alone have soared 550% since 2019. Unemployment is soaring, businesses are closing, and the country is hemorrhaging tens of thousands of people to emigration. Power outages can last for days, and internet services have become intermittent, and there are shortages of medications from over-the-counter painkillers to cancer drugs in a country once called the hospital of the Middle East. Hours and even days-long lines for staples like bread and gas have become the norm. Another factor is that many of these basic necessities are imported from other Middle Eastern countries, almost 25%, and Lebanon has consistently struggled to get along with its neighbors, most notably in 2006, when Hezbollah provoked a war with Israel, which killed or injured thousands and displaced over 1 million in Lebanon. Economically, this destroyed millions of dollars worth of infrastructure, with Lebanon still unable to fully recover. To make matters worse, the ongoing Syrian civil war has made the already struggling labor market in Lebanon far more competitive, as displaced immigrants and refugees struggle to find peace and stability. All of this neatly ties into what sparked this essay to begin with, the gargantuan flood of garbage, piling up in the streets and making it even more difficult for society to function. For a country whose natural beauty dubbed it the Switzerland of the Middle East, its government has become almost completely incapable of and disinterested in managing the increasingly dangerous and obstructive piles of waste. Due in part to the aforementioned economic woes and corruption, the state has failed to do hardly anything about it, with the only refuge being that, according to Al Jazeera, most Lebanese simply can't afford to produce as much waste as they used to. While private garbage collecting companies filled bottles with liquids to charge the government more for the waste they collected, the state continued to award contracts to political elites based on loyalty and ties rather than ability, or even enough basic competence and regulation to do their job at all. This cronyism was so ubiquitous that even the United States would sanction some of these waste management businessmen. This is yet another angle into the many environmental challenges faced by both the Middle East and the entire world. The plastics, metals, and other materials that don't easily break down are reportedly being dumped into the Mediterranean, making the threat present for habitats both on land and at sea. As if to make matters worse could be Lebanon's national motto, the country is also home to one of the worst animal trafficking hubs in the world, where, in the words of the African Conservation Foundation, each year thousands, if not tens of thousands of animals are brought illegally into the country, where they are sold, transferred, abandoned, or abused. This, among many other awful things, is the result of a failed state, the terrible and natural outcome of crony laissez-faire ideology, combined with decades of political and social turbulence, and justified by the divine and unquestionable will of Hezbollah's Allah. As Lebanon is gradually strangled by its mounting debts and challenges, as well as the destruction of its lands, the government will be forced to face its fatal flaws with a serious vigor and reform. Either that, or few will be left to wonder what happened to the Pearl of the Middle East.